Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 204th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast, and it's South Asian Heritage Month. And this year's theme is all about celebrating the stories that make up our diverse and vibrant community as South Asians. And today we are exploring success, flipping it, and talking about what it really means. And to join me in doing this is Mohammed Kasujee. Mohammed is an executive coach who specialises in helping corporate executives and business founders bridge the gap between personal fulfilment and professional success. Mohammed enjoyed a corporate career in medical sales before stepping into the world of entrepreneurship. He currently balances his time between one-to-one coaching and managing his professional branding company, MK Career Solutions. Additionally, Mohammed is a sought-after keynote speaker and also serves as an advisory board member for startups and non-profits. So, Mohammed, a huge welcome to the show, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Layla, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And I know you're super busy, so thank you so much for making time for us, especially in South Asian Heritage Month. Now, of course, I've read out your bio, but I think it's really great for listeners to hear what you're working on at the moment.
Sure thing. So I split my time almost between three different components. Number one, I'm a coach. I'm an executive coach. So I specialize in working with corporate executives and business founders, usually those either side of a transition, either transitioning into something new, a new role, or wanting to transition to a new role, or a new business venture. And once they've made that transition, then we work together through almost the onboarding. So the first 3 to 6 months, really. So it keeps me very busy. Whilst I'm not involved in the coaching, I love public speaking. So I'm a keynote speaker, talking on the topics of identity, work-life balance, career transition, personal success and fulfillment. And if that doesn't keep me busy enough in my spare time, I love writing around the topics that I've just mentioned as well.
Yeah, so you've got a lot on, and you talk a lot about your personal journey in terms of flipping this definition of success. So I think it's great to talk about, what was your journey to doing what you do now?
Absolutely. I guess from the realms of success, my journey started pretty early on, especially like most South Asian individuals, especially mine from a very conservative Indian background. The path to success starts the moment you're born, really, and the grades, academia, it's instilled into you from a young age, and anything other than the best isn't good enough. And I was on that journey, and thankfully, I had a good education and good parents who, gave me the educational foundation that I needed. But that was always the bar for what success was. It was about the best grades, and then going into high school and the best GCSEs and the A levels. And up until GCSEs, I think that journey was going quite well. At A levels, I had a bit of complacency, and that was my first taste of failure, I would say, where I didn't get the A levels that I wanted, which meant the university grades weren't sufficient enough to get the universities that I wanted. And that was probably the first turning point that I had in life, where things didn't go to plan and success was reevaluated on a different metric. Following on from that, I did manage to get a place at Manchester Met University. I studied a degree in chemistry, which was fantastic. Absolutely loved doing the degree itself, but didn't see myself having a career in chemistry after I'd finished. That took me into a career in medical sales shortly after graduation. And then that's when we start thinking about success from a very different angle, really, because up until that point, it was initially about grades. And then finishing up from university, it was always about money, getting the money to settle down, to be financially stable, to have enough money in the pot to get married, children, house, etc., the usual route. And it was only as I started going along those routes and ticking off all of those boxes that I realized that success, or the conventional version of success, wasn't necessarily the one that aligned to what I wanted. And after enjoying a very, very lucrative career in medical sales, I hit a point where I realized that money wasn't doing it for me in terms of a success metric. And it was then that my version and direction for success moved towards more something towards fulfillment. And that eventually led me to transition away from my corporate job, start my own business, which was around professional branding and career consulting, helping people find fulfillment in jobs and in their work. And ultimately, that's what springboarded the journey onto the next part of my life, which was about helping people through career transitions and eventually one-to-one coaching and consulting, and the world opened up from there, really. So that's a potted history of me and my journey.
Oh, thank you for Mohammed for sharing that. And you said something really interesting. You said you come from a conservative Indian family. What does that mean to you? So are you, and you don't have to answer this, but are you talking about politically conservative or are you talking about ideologically conservative, firstly? And the second thing, as you were talking, because so much resonated with me, is, a lot of the time we have those stereotypes about the very wide definition of South Asian communities. But of course, I think a lot of the times it's because we very much live in fear. And there's always that immigrant mindset that things can be lost at a moment's notice. So it's this thing about conservative Indian family, but also ultimately, what do you think underpins that?
Completely. I think they work hand in hand. I mean, ideologically rather than politically in terms of conservativeness, and that's because my family, my grandparents on both sides came from India to England around the same time, which was around the 1960s. They dropped pretty comfortable lives back home in order to build a life here. But of course, promises from the British government weren't as they seemed, and their degrees didn't translate, their skills didn't translate, and they pretty much had to start from the bottom. And, I'm sure this is something that many people from an Asian background resonate with. They came to this country, quite often it was 2 or 3 families living in a small 2-bedroom or 1-bedroom terraced house, working menial jobs, working round the clock. My grandfather used to tell me sometimes of working 48-hour days and, not seeing his family sometimes for 2 weeks consecutively because of the shift patterns and stuff. And ultimately, all of the sacrifices they made, moving to a new country, learning a new language, giving up comfort, struggling to survive for a long time, meant that when they had children, the big philosophy and ethos was, we've worked very, very hard to make this happen. Please don't throw away all of the effort and energy and sacrifice we've done. And what that meant was they instilled within my parents a very strong culture of, do the safe thing, do the risk averse thing. And that typically presented itself in get good grades, get a respectable job, as they say, and then don't do anything too crazy. So get a respectable job, will help you with your house, get a mortgage, get married, and then create the same framework for your children to do the same. So that's where my idea of conservatism came from. And it meant that, and there's no fault to anyone for this because I completely understand where they came from, but it meant that I had a very narrow field of vision coming out of university and going into the working world.
And I think the other thing it does, and it's not intentional, but I think there is a huge amount of anxiety and anxiety disorders within South Asian British communities. I think particularly, if talking about Indian and Pakistani, and it's because there is a fear, I think, that the fear that underpins the things that you've just outlined. So I think that it's really difficult because if you move away from that, because there is such a community mentality, you're risking kind of the community as well when you do those things. So to be a circuit breaker or a cycle breaker, there's a kind of a positivity for you potentially, but there's also a hell of a lot to hold.
Completely. So when I was in medical sales, although that isn't a typical job you'd associate with Asian culture, people kind of knew what it was. People saw the salary, or people saw the car that I was driving. People saw the company I was working for, and there was a perception of success associated around that. And when I started telling people in my family that I wanted to leave all that behind to start a business, especially what initially started as a professional branding service, which is i.e., done for you CV writing services, people looked at me like I was about to commit mass murder or something. They were thinking, why on earth would you do that? It seemed preposterous. I could see them trying to compute it in their mind as I was talking, and almost their minds imploding, thinking this just seems a bit crazy, really. Why would you give up all of the safety and security for some really unknown thing? And you're right. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of trepidation around that as well. And by default, that does pass on to me too, which meant that probably the hardest decision I had to make to date was overcoming that kind of mindset, breaking away from that programming and thinking at this moment in time, fulfillment is more important to me than stability and security, because ultimately, that the price you pay for stability and security is, dissatisfaction, an unfulfilled life. And there's only so long you can do that.
Yeah. And how can we ever guarantee what's 100% secure anyway? Like, of course we can do things, but we can't foresee everything. So on that then, how do you define success now, and how do you work with your clients to define what success means for them?
Completely. I think everyone's version of success is independent, but I think a primary driver of what success really means is a life that feels fulfilling. And I say life because it's not exclusive to just work. A life that feels equally fulfilling inside of work and outside of work. I think most of my clients tend to be of a similar nature, where work is great. They're very engaged with their work often, but often it comes at a price of either they love it so much that there's no time for anything else, or the moment they step off that computer screen, or the moment they step back into the house, there's a very big disconnect with how enjoyable and engaging work is, and how unenjoyable and disengaging their family and their personal life is. And I think bridging the gap between the two, creating a life where your career and your professional growth accelerates with the same level of fulfillment that your personal life does, I think that's what true success means, really. And that's why it's about having a life that feels fulfilling, not just work, because the imbalance is what creates a lot of dissatisfaction for most people.
And I think it takes work as well, doesn't it, to work that out? I think some of us, when we've been taught this way and we feel loyal to that mindset, to unpick that is a real journey. And I think some of the first steps are to try and work out why we feel the way we do about success. And I think another thing, something I definitely experienced was, you can tick all the boxes and then you go, sugar, now what? And who was I doing this for? And I think that can create a huge chasm that you almost feel you're tumbling down into. So I don't know if that sounds familiar to you.
Completely. I would say the typical age of a client of mine is usually between 40 to 50. And I didn't realize this at the time. I was just explaining who my ideal client or typical client was to someone in the marketing field. And they were like, oh, okay. So it's people who are having a midlife crisis then. And I never thought of it like that. And then it made complete sense to me, because usually the clients I work with have usually reached a point in their life where money's pretty okay. They've probably paid off the mortgage or on course to. Their kids are on the way to being looked after, or on their way now to university, or left school and doing their own thing. And you get to a point where life you're no longer forced to think about life from a money perspective. It's no longer about paying off something or saving enough money for someone else. And once you remove that motivation, then you're left with a thing of, oh, wow, what is my life amounting to? What am I doing? What does purpose actually mean? Because up until that point, if all you have to think about is money, you don't really have the time or the bandwidth to think about anything else. But then you get to that point and you think, now what? I've got so much time to go. How can I make my life feel worth it? How can I make all that time away from family, all those late nights, all those compromises to my marriage and my health and everything else? How can I make this feel worth it? And it can be quite a daunting prospect. And I think that's why midlife crisis happen to a degree, is that people realize that I've given up a lot. And what's it amounted to? I need to start living life now.
Yeah, it's so true. 40 is really, really tough. And so what about the term mental well-being? What does that term mean to you?
I think mental well-being is taking a new term, especially for me. I think a few years ago, we started to see the word kind of mental health coming to the forefront of things. But I think it was just great that people, it felt great to people just talking about it. It's great that we're talking about mental health. But what does taking care of your mental health actually mean? And it differs for everyone. I think for me, the biggest component for me, which I've overcome and has had the biggest impact on my mental health, is being comfortable with myself, being comfortable just being. And it seems really obvious, but I struggled with this for a long time. And I see many other people do, in the sense that it's so easy when we have a moment of silence, or when we have a moment of what we think is quiet, to just pull out a phone and start scrolling or put something on. It's so easy when we're in transit between work or going to the shops or something to have a podcast on, or to have the radio on, or to have music on. It's so tempting to always have something on, something to distract us from just being ourselves. And, I'm not a mental health specialist or anything like that, but most of us, and me, and I'm talking to my former version of myself more than anything else, is that most of us don't even take the time to just truly listen, because quite often feelings of anxiety and stress, a lot of the time they're just indicators for something else that's going on. And if we took the time to listen and be more present and be more comfortable with what's going on, it could give us a better indication idea of what's really troubling us, or what's really causing us the challenges, which we can then go and address through mental health professionals, therapy, counseling, coaching, etc., etc. So I think I can't speak for all mental health and well-being, but presence is certainly a key foundation and cornerstone for me.
Thank you. And it's getting, yeah, we all do it because it's also readily available. And yeah, there's really interesting podcasts and audiobooks, but yeah, you're right, being present and being in that stillness. And we've talked about our slice of South Asian culture, and thinking about mental ill health and culture from our South Asian backgrounds. What do you think the biggest challenges are in recognizing when things aren't going to plan? Or maybe I'll reframe that and say when things are going to plan and it doesn't feel fulfilling for people and they start to feel those sensations that we've been talking about.
When things aren't going to plan, when things aren't going well, you're not feeling fulfilled, and it feels something a bit deeper. I think the best thing one can do is at least talk about it to someone and vocalize it. The things that remain kind of bottled up, the things that remain unspoken about, are the things that haunt us the most. I think South Asian culture obviously is a bit behind the times when it comes to mental health and well-being. Some of the challenges associated with that is that because cultural things come into play, like black magic and things like that, and also elements of what would other people think as well. But I think as South Asian people, kind of similar to my journey that I took purely from a career perspective, is that being able to decouple what's important for you from what other people think. I think since conception, what will other people think is almost part of our programming as Asian people, really. And if we can decouple what other people think from what's truly important to us, that will give us the freedom to be able to actually take action on anything, whether it's a mental health and well-being issue, whether it's a life and career fulfillment issue, or anything else.
And what about when, for you, when things actually you said you ticked all those boxes, but you thought money's not really doing it for me anymore, and that can cause quite a lot of turbulence. Yeah, what do what about how would people recognize that in themselves, and what could they do about it?
I think it's about presence, number one, going back to my point earlier about not ignoring any nagging feeling that something doesn't feel right or something that doesn't feel authentic. And then number two is going through the process and the journey of figuring out what does. And this is not a here today, change tomorrow sort of situation. It takes time and there's no magic silver bullet. But what I often find with a lot of the clients, and where I found my spark, was quite often the answers are within you. And I don't want to sound cliche or too mystical here, but quite often the answers of what true fulfillment lies usually in your childhood or your younger years. And I think over time, we start to deviate from that. Our inauthenticities come from having to do what other people want us to do or having to behave how other people behave. So for me, for example, from a young age, I was always your kind of archetypal nerd at school. I used to love getting my work done really quickly, not so I could brag about it, but then I could go around and I could help other people. And my top subject at school was always kind of English related. So I loved writing, I loved helping people. And I remember I always got a deep sense of fulfillment from doing that. Now, over time, that seemed to disappear, move away, particularly because kind of the subjects associated with that weren't ones that were encouraged from an Asian household to go and pursue. So as I was getting older, that started to fade away. But one thing that was prevalent was, like, ever since university, I was always happy to leverage that kind of helping satisfaction I got in the realm of kind of job search. So helping people with CVs, job applications. I remember at school when I was in year 8 or 9, I was helping the sixth formers get their uni applications done for free. It was just something that I did. So that area of helping people using my language skills were always there. So as I got older, that turned into kind of job search. And I found that alongside my job, I was always just helping people with job search stuff. I'd spend Sunday evenings writing CVs for people. So the moment I felt dissatisfied and I knew that what I was doing wasn't it, I just started leaning into other things in my life that I enjoyed more, i.e. helping people. And initially it was something that I did for free. And then I started helping more and more people, and it became friends of friends and family of friends, and people I didn't know were approaching me. And literally one day, someone just insisted on paying me for my service, even though I didn't ask them for any money. And it was that spark that gave me the confidence that this could become a professional endeavor. Slowly but surely, over a period of 18 months, I transitioned from doing corporate work to leaving my role and going into full-time entrepreneurship. So, and I've done this process with my clients maybe 100, 120, 125 times now. And the answers are always in your past and your timeline. Lean into the things that feel fulfilling and just do more of them. You don't have to get paid for it straight away. You don't have to quit your job. Just do more and more and more until you are limited by the job that you're doing. And then, and only then, do you have to make a decision about how far you want to take it.
That's so helpful and really similar to my story about how my business started as well. So we've talked a lot about individuals, but what do you think workplaces can do to create resilient systems and to recognize, of course, that people are going to have different varying cultural needs because we all have a culture. So creating resilient systems with culture in mind, what do you think workplaces can be doing or should be doing?
It's a tricky question because culture is so broad and so diverse as a whole. I think where it stands today, from a lot of the clients I work with who are in the more senior positions of authority, I think people are at this moment in time willing to ask the opinions of the workforce, but the challenge often lies in what's done with that information. At the moment, it feels like there's a lot of collection, but not a lot of evaluation and then consequent, adaptation or execution of new ideas. So maybe that's the next step is, and I'm not really sure how this works because it's not something I'm an expert in, but maybe the difference now is some way of facilitating any of the insights actually be getting turned into action. Maybe how these things are benchmarked need to be focused more on a longer term. So maybe rather than something that's done on an annual basis, something where any action points that are raised and given, what percentage of those are actually executed or implemented over a 2, 3, 4 year period. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
I think that's a very insightful answer, actually. I think you're absolutely right. And in the 200th celebration episode with Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey, we talked about that. People don't want to give their data. They don't want to give information because they don't see then what's actually happening with it. So, really insightful there. And then finally, of course, you are incredibly busy. You told us that what you're working on. How do you look after your own mental health? And what are your top 3 tips? What would you like to share with listeners?
Right. So having experienced burnout 3 times, all of which were progressively worse, I realized that taking care of my own health and well-being had to be a massive priority. So there's a lot of kind of measures I have in place, really. I think number 1 is having an integrated calendar. And what I mean is, before, there used to be a work calendar and everything else just kind of worked around that. And the other calendar was in my head, personal time, family time, everything else was just in my head. And as you can imagine, if it wasn't prioritized in the same way as work, it took a backseat. So the first step I would have is to have an integrated calendar, really, of personal and professional time. And what that allows me to do is have really strict boundaries about when I am working and when I'm not working. And it means that the time that is scheduled for rest is as sacred as a meeting or as making time for this podcast, for example. It doesn't move, it doesn't budge. I think number 2 is understanding that rest and recuperation isn't necessarily a function of time, but a function of energy. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that the natural assumption is, if I take 1 day off, I'll feel better, or if I go to sleep 1 hour later, or 1 hour earlier, I'll feel better. But what I found is actually it doesn't work that way. So, for example, I actually feel a lot more energized if I wake up an hour and a half earlier than I used to. So before, I used to wake up at, around 7 o'clock. Now I wake up between 5 and 4:30, and I go to bed at the same time. Now, one may think, you'd feel more tired, wouldn't you? But it's actually the opposite, because when you have kids, when you've got a busy life, what actually gives me energy is waking up in the morning and having at least an hour of quiet time, whether that's meditation, journaling, reading a book. That as a result gives me energy. And if you start looking at your calendar and your activities as a function of energy rather than time, you'll be able to find ways to feel a lot more energized and rejuvenated. So, for example, reading a book and having time to myself, if that's incorporated into my day every day, it gives me more energy than going to sleep earlier and waking up at the same time does. So it's important for all of us to think about what actually energizes us and what drains us. And if you think of the energy and from an energy component, you might actually find that just changing the activities you do, despite having the same amount of time in your calendar and your day, will give you a lot more energy and make you feel a lot more rejuvenated. I think number 3 is understanding, and from a burnout perspective, that more hours does not equal more productivity. Again, another thing that I've inherited, and my biggest gifts can also be my biggest weaknesses too. But from an Asian perspective, we often associate working hard with being productive, and it's almost like a badge of honor that we have. I'm sure we've all got older relatives, whether from this country or abroad or wherever, who talk about the long days they used to do and the struggles they had. And that becomes almost glorified to a point where we think the only way we will be enough, the only way that our life has purpose and meaning, is if we're working loads and loads of loads, and if all the people around us see that. But it doesn't, because after a certain point, there is a law of diminishing returns where the hours that you work actually deplete your productivity. So making time for rest and for yourself in whatever ways rejuvenate you and give you energy, actually increases your productivity over the long run at the short term. So those kind of activities for me, I think I've mentioned a few: meditation, journaling. I take every few weeks, I'll take some time off to go hiking because that's like my thing. I love spending time in nature. Present time to yourself is good. Exercise, all of these things work really, really well for me. But of course, for the individual, it's entirely up to them as to what gives them energy.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. So I never get tired of asking that question because no one ever has the same 3 tips. That's brilliant. And finally, of course, if people want to know more about your work, how should they contact you? And I will, of course, include the links and information in the show notes.
Brilliant. No, it's a pleasure. I like to live on LinkedIn. So if anyone would like to learn a bit more about me or read some of the articles that I've written on this topic, they're more than welcome to find me. It's MohamedKasujee. And that's the best place to find me and learn more.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful and really insightful. So really appreciate that. And listeners, do stay tuned next week where we'll be talking more about South Asian Heritage Month and having guests with useful insights on Tell Your Story. So until then, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.